Welcome to the Political Fallout Shelter, where we come to you each week from the basement in the Capitol to give you the latest on defense news up here. I'm Leo Shane, Deputy Editor for Military Times, and with me, as he is each week, is the man who makes defense contract auditing the most exciting thing in the world, Joe Gould.
Woohoo!
Joe, how you doing this week?
Doing great.
So, listen, another busy week coming up for us here. We're in the middle of NDAA season, the National Defense Authorization Act, and it's something that consumes most of our lives, most of April, May, and June.
Right.
I wanted to start just by explaining to people why it does. I mean, we spend so much time focused on this one bill. What is it, and why do we do this to ourselves?
Well, I don't know the answer for why we do this to ourselves, but it's the annual defense policy bill, and it's hundreds of pages of long. It details it sort of creates the policy bucket for appropriators to pour in ships, jets, troop numbers. So that and then also there's all sorts of personnel policy, and this year I think we're bound to see a number of partisan fights on personnel policy.
Just for us, defense insiders are always watching this as the one bill that comes up each year and passes each year. It's been more than 50 years in a row now that they've passed this one piece of legislation, which, let's face it, up here in Capitol Hill is a major achievement. If you can get even the basic work done year to year, that's a success. So. But it also, this is half of the budget arrangement for the Defense Department each year. So, as you said, all these policy things get really interesting. We've seen this bill contain the don't ask, don't tell repeal in recent years. We've seen it contain, a major overhaul of military retirement. We've seen it, hit not only issues that are really particular to the defense industry and to the defense community, but also larger, more bigger social topics.
Yeah, that's totally right.
So racial topics. We've seen some gun topics in recent years. Firearms on bases. How does that play? How does that not? So there's a lot in this bill each year. Not only for folks like us who will spend 18 hours tracking it in a couple of weeks here, but for folks who are outside. So
yeah, that's right. To be clear about some of the logistics, when you say 18 hours tracking it, there's a...
I mean 18 hours tracking it.
You mean 18 hours tracking it, yeah. And what you're referring to is the marathon House Armed Services full committee markup. It lasts... It tends to last 18 hours. It last year was a little bit less. The House marks up its bill, considers amendments, they get debated, they get voted on. It's actually something that it's sort of the regular order process that you don't always see anymore.
That's what
I
was going to say. It's almost remarkable how transparent a lot of this is. Sure.
Well, to be clear, the Senate Armed Services Committee doesn't do its markup in public. I think that's its tradition, and so we will not get to see the internal debate. And I think the justification on their side is that this allows them to be a little bit more forthcoming with one another, without the C-SPAN cameras on.
Right, but it makes all of us reporters cranky, and there is a lack of debate that you see on this. So while the House side, sure, there are some things that are happening behind the scenes. This week they're finalizing the drafts. They'll start to work that together. We do have one day, it starts about 10 a.m. and it usually ends sometime after midnight, where it's continuous debate on all of these topics. We'll go from, how many planes should we buy? What's the end strength should we have? To transgender issues, to, those gun issues, don't ask, don't tell. The sage grouse was one a few years ago that, there was a large debate about endangered species and that encroaching on military testing grounds and how should that get. Right. And, anybody can tune in and actually watch how a bill becomes law.
Right. And typically you and I cover it. We tag in and tag out. I tag you in for personnel policy.
And I tag into you for everything else and try and avoid the rest of it.
Well, particularly acquisition reform.
So what are we expecting this year in the bill? What are the big things? The last few years we've seen some pretty impressive reform overhauls with acquisition, with personnel, with retirement. Some big end strength plus ups. Should we expect the same this year?
Well, what we know, some of the suspense that we're typically in around the top line number, that's usually big. That's like a messaging move from the House Armed Services Committee Chairman Mac Thornberry. But this year there's a 2-year budget deal, so we know that it's going to be $716 billion. Mm-hmm. So,
So that should make everything easy, and we'll be
right,
done.
that's
We'll be done by
sure.
noon.
Well, but the marquee policy provision this year and last year, I would say the headline grabbing policy provision from the committee was Space Corps. You know the
Not the SBP DIC offset.
what is that?
That's it.
the so the so the it never made it into the final bill, but it you know, and to be fair, there's a lot of negotiating that goes on. You know, these bills get unveiled this week. They get debated, you know, several weeks from now during the markup, and then over the summer, the what are called the Big Four, the leaders of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, the Democrats and Republicans, will debate those bills behind closed doors, negotiate, and then sometime around, you know, August or fall, they start to get that's when we start to see some they start to wind down. But to answer your question about what's in the bill this year, we saw Mac Thornberry unveil this past week the a policy provision that aims to shutter 7 so-called fourth estate agencies within the Department of Defense. His way of getting after redundancy and waste.
And these are agencies that aren't direct military agencies. They're sort of support agencies, and a lot of civilian employees. I think he said $100 billion is spending each year, about 200,000 civilian employees. So
Right.
a really big part of the defense apparatus that isn't directly related to troops.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways maybe he's nodding towards folks who would take a more austere approach to the Department of Defense. He's saying what I read in this is that they just got a major plus up, and he's saying, hey, just because we got this plus up doesn't mean that we're not gonna put on the green eye shades and try to find savings. Now,
So he's proposed a 25% cut to some of these agencies. It's sort of amorphous exactly what that cut amounts to and how many people it amounts to, but we're talking about potentially thousands of defense civilian jobs going out the window and a lot of reorganization in some of these
yeah,
agencies.
that's exactly right. Now, to be clear, they're not taking aim at all of the support agencies, and $100 billion is the figure that covers all of those agencies. However, he's excluding intel agencies, combat support agencies. And as you might imagine, those are the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. These are the agencies actually that eat up the lion's share of that $100 billion. And so we saw some witnesses at a hearing on the Fourth Estate really lay out that there's not that much fat left to trim. You know, when you exclude these other agencies, the Defense Health Agency is also excluded.
Right, and I think we pressed him on that. There's some IT jobs within the Defense Health Agency that could be hit, but not the medical jobs. So there's a lot of wiggle room in here. Look, this is the ongoing fight we've been seeing for years up here. We've got to cut waste, we've got to cut inefficiency, but how much does that actually really produce in savings? And the pushback on this was pretty fierce. We had the ranking member, Adam Smith, of the House Armed Services Committee say, no, essentially, like this isn't going to work.
He said he's concerned. He used the word. On the one, it was a somewhat measured statement in that he said that he thought that this was going to potentially inflict damage on the Department of Defense, but at the same time, he said he looked forward to working with Mac Thornberry. Now, again, we know that this is maybe his opening offer, so to speak. You know, there's going to be a negotiation that's going to take months. And, you know, if you're going to go into negotiations, maybe it helps to take a hostage, right? You
So cynical.
well, I think we've seen in past years that this happens, that where you end up in the end is different from where you finish. And even he has acknowledged, you know, amid some of the pushback that he's open to negotiations on this.
So speaking of the negotiations taking months, this is just one half. We'll be obsessed over the next couple of weeks here with just the House side. But we've got the Senate side coming up, as you said. A lot of that happens behind closed doors. And a lot of that in recent years has happened, you know, through the force of personality of Senator McCain, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. We don't know if he's going to be back for the debate this year. There were rumors that he'd be back in early May. He was targeting that as a site to come back. He's been in Arizona dealing with his cancer treatments. He recently had an additional surgery related to that. If Senator McCain's not up here, how does that change the debate for this massive policy bill? In the next few months.
I think that's kind of the $1 million question. I think it's difficult to know. Um, Clearly, he is a force up here, and force to be reckoned with. And so, we have been, the people I talk to, we're given to understand that this is still going to be a McCain bill. The staff in the committee hasn't changed, even if he's not here. And
Well, and Jim Inhofe, who's the number two Republican on the committee for months now, has been saying, "Look, I'm running the day-to-day operations here, but it's still McCain's committee. He's calling the shots. He's not physically here, but he is very much still running everything.
I
But
would
if
say,
he's not in town for this part, that's a whole different dynamic."
well, that's a good point. I think Senator Inhofe has really striven to be gentlemanly, and John McCain's health is a question mark, and I think he's been very careful not to overstep. Although he is the next in line to be chairman.
I mean, it's one thing to be running these hearings and to be how you question witnesses. Certainly, there's a different feel, but it's a different thing when you're crafting the policy behind the scenes. What does it actually What does it actually do? What priorities rise? What priorities fall?
And these are two different men too. John McCain's priorities might not be the same as Jim Inhofe's priorities, and how that gets handled. If McCain is sort of running things. I mean, I think it's a big question, and you know what? We may never know. We may never, because it's going to happen behind closed doors, so it's going to be hard to tell. But I think those are the questions.
Okay. Well, look, while we're going to be obsessed with this authorization bill for the next 2 months, 3 months, 4 months moving ahead.
I know what you're obsessed with. Ronny Jackson, VA Secretary nominee.
I couldn't let you go without throwing the VA stuff back in here again. Ronny Jackson is going to have his confirmation hearing on Wednesday. Big deal, lots of questions surrounding him. He's met with senators over the last few days. Senator John Tester came away saying he felt positive, although not fully convinced after his meeting with him. He's the top Democrat on the Senate Affairs Committee. Could be a real thorn in the confirmation process here. But also said that, some of the questions he asked Dr. Jackson about medical care outside of VA, these privatization concerns, things like this, he liked his answers, but didn't, that Jackson still hadn't talked to Trump about them yet. So, real, and this, the disconnect between former VA Secretary Shulkin and Donald Trump was ultimately what led to his ouster. So,
so to be clear, Ronny Jackson was up here, earlier this month, and so making the rounds.
You took a picture of him walking around. And
somebody was holding his cover. It got a lot of retweets.
It's because everybody loves veterans news. I keep telling you got to get more in defense news here.
So what's your speculation on what kind of reception he's going to get? Is it going to be an easy confirmation? Is it going to be tough, or folks are going to be trying to catch him off balance on as he doesn't have really any management experience to speak of?
I mean that's definitely going to be one of the big issues. Is all right, you've been the White House physician, you've managed this small staff and this small weird section of the military, but you've never gotten close to managing something the size of VA, $200 billion bureaucracy with 375,000 plus employees. So that'll definitely be one line of questioning that I'll be watching at his confirmation hearing.
Can I put you on the spot? Will you recount for us the anecdote about Ronny Jackson and George W. Bush?
So that was in the Washington Post this week, and I don't know, are we still a PG podcast, or are we? Yeah, the Post had a really good profile on Jackson, talking about how he's sort of worked his way up unassumingly through these different places, and had a real close relationship with not just Donald Trump, but with Obama and with George W. Bush. George W. Bush gave him a very colorful nickname after Jackson shared with him a story about having to stitch up some of his
sensitive part of his anatomy.
I believe that's what they said in the story. So you can look that one up on your own. But look, that plays into this larger issue of how did he end up, with this appointment? Is it because he's got some special skill set that really speaks to VA reform and VA challenges, or is it just Trump liked the guy and said, hey, you're in the military, you're kind of a veteran, let's put you in charge here. You can probably do it.
That's kind of the rap on him.
So yeah, and that's going to be one of the big things. This privatization healthcare issue is going to be a big thing. I wrote a story about electronic medical records recently that has been a major issue for VA. So that's going to be it. There's a ton of stuff, and I know the nominee has been cramming to catch up on all this. This confirmation hearing is going to be big. We'll see whether or not folks do trip him up, whether or not he looks overwhelmed by the moment, or if some of the charm that we hear behind the scenes can come through.
Is he going to have to walk a tightrope on privatization? Is that a partisan issue?
Yes and no. I mean, it's an easy thing to say you're against because it means a different thing to everybody. And, we've written a few stories on this at Military Times too, but the question's not going to be, do you favor privatizing VA? It's going to be, what is your vision for how much care should go outside of VA? So the really 30-second version of all of this is privatization is bad, but privatization to some people means closing every VA hospital tomorrow and doing nothing else. To other people, it means slowly siphoning resources off and sort of hollowing out VA. And that's what a lot of the veterans groups are worried about. So is Jackson going to favor a very aggressive, let's let veterans go pretty much anywhere, maybe even take vouchers with them, that kind of plan? Or is it going to be more of a VA stays at the center of these care plans and still has a vital role, still has a really robust health system for these veterans? And then there's also some outside care that goes into this. So, but really, really complicated things for somebody who up until 2 months ago, I'm not sure how much he even knew about the VA system. He's worked in it some, but didn't have to deal with these things. So look, those are the big issues that we'll be covering over the next week here. You can follow me at militarytimes.com and Joe on defensenews.com. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm at Leo Shane.
And I'm at Reporter Joe.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.